is really a third midterm, as I've said before. So it begins with the material we had last week. Didn't we have two lectures last time before the exam?
Hmm.
So starting with that, and from now on, that's on the final. Okay, so none of. I'm not going to ask questions from stuff that we have already. So, any questions in general, or should we start? Or
Where are we?
where are we? In what respect?
Just oh, evolution. Okay.
Evolution. We're on
All right.
evolution. So that's where we are. Okay. So I'm going to come back to these ideas right here, but the main thing we're going to be talking about in terms of evolution is descent with modification. What that really refers to is change over time. And what it's really referring to is change in gene frequencies over time. We'll come back to that. And then, of course, we'll spend a fair amount of time on theory of natural selection. So I just put those up because those are kind of important ideas here, but especially natural selection. Now, here's the thing. We're going to be talking about evolution. We're talking about change, how organisms change over time. And, you know, this is not a new idea. It certainly wasn't new with Darwin. The Greeks were talking about it 2,500 years ago, so it's not a new idea that things change. And if you do any kinds of breeding experiments with plants or animals or something like that, you see change over short periods of time. We're talking about major changes over long periods of time, but you can see change over short periods of time. And we'll come back to that idea in a few minutes. But I want to just give a little bit of background to Darwin, because he came up with a theory of natural selection, which was a mechanism for change. That was what was such a big thing about that. He provided a mechanism for change. People have been talking about change, as I said, for hundreds and hundreds of years. Organisms change. How? Nobody knew. And various people came up with some ideas. And I'll talk a little bit about Lamarck, for example, his ideas. But as I said, it was Darwin who came up with a mechanism, and it's brilliant. It was a brilliant idea, and he amassed all kinds of evidence before he actually published anything, because he was a good scientist and he wanted to have evidence. He wanted to have a lot of evidence. He didn't want to just come up with an idea. So, but what happened was this. He was originally he went to college. He went to Cambridge to be a preacher. He was going to be that was his original idea. And but he did a lot of. He loved natural history, so he did a lot of work in natural history. And then this is back in the 1800s, and the British were exploring all kinds of the world. Actually, it's to be honest, imperialism. They're looking for other places to take over
conquer,
and to exploit, obviously. Yes. But whatever. The point is that they were sending ships all around the world, looking at new places. Looking at are there minerals that can be exploited? Are there good plants that we can use for food or whatever? Mm-hmm. And so there's this particular boat called the Beagle that was going around the world, or well, not necessarily around the world, but making a trip. Actually, they did go a large part of the world, and they needed a naturalist. They always took, they'd have a doctor with them. They'd have a naturalist. They had various peoples that would be on the ship, and then the workers who did all the work. Anyway, so someone gave Darwin's name to Fitzroy, the guy who was the captain, and he said, "Sure, fine." So Darwin was young. He's early 20s, and he went on this trip. And it was a 5-year voyage, And while he was gone, they traveled, they went up and down the coast of South America on both sides of it, including the Galapagos Islands, and that was a big thing, the Galapagos Islands, which I'll talk about. That was a big thing. But not just that. They'd stop at various ports, and Darwin, as a naturalist, would go out, he'd collect specimens, and he'd take good field notes of what he saw and all that. And so, and various things struck him on his journey, And then he also, as I said, he got all these collections, and he would examine these things when he came home. Various things were really surprising to him. And one of them, for example, the one they always talk about, but the important one, the Galapagos Islands. It's a series of these islands off of Peru, and I forget how many thousands of miles off of Peru. It's a ways off, and there's several different islands. And he examined. I mean, he went around the different islands, and there were these big tortoises, but each island had a slightly different form of the tortoise. There were these finches. The finches on each island were slightly different. And various other animals the same thing. But he noticed that they're all different. They're all different depending upon what the island is like. If the island was a little drier versus if it was wetter. If they were eating, the finches were eating nuts that were really hard versus not so hard or difficult to get to because they were, versus out in the open. Whatever the conditions were, it turned out that the organisms there that were dealing with it were a little bit different. And the natives who came from the island, people who lived in the island, they could immediately spot a finch or a tortoise or whatever and say, hey, that's from such and such an island. That was from the other island. So it was well known. And what occurred to Darwin is that they all came from the same original. The finches all came from the same original finch, and the tortoises all came from the same original tortoise. And all these other animals, they all, and some of them obviously originated from the mainland, Peru, and somehow got to the island. The birds, they could fly maybe, but other animals, how they get there? Well, they could have gotten there by accident, on some floating raft. Who knows? But we're talking thousands and thousands of years anyway. But the point is, before humans ever got to these islands, all these other animals were there and were changing, and so that kind of struck Darwin. Now, he was familiar with London, and back in London, people bred. What were those birds they bred? Now I'm forgetting the bird. Starts with a P, not a partridge, not a parrot, but what was it? I think it starts with a P. Maybe it doesn't start with a P. I'm forgetting right now. But people breed them and show them. Some bird. What is it? Even know? I can't.
A macaw?
No. What? Not parakeets or parrots. Bigger bird. I can't think of it. Never mind. It's not important. But the point is that there were all kinds of varieties, just as there are with dogs. You have everything from the Chihuahua to the Great Dane and all these other dogs. They all started from the same animal. A wolf. But because of breeding and choosing for the kinds of traits that you want, that's selective breeding, right?
Mm-hmm.
As opposed to just random breeding that we'll talk about when we're talking about natural selection in general. But you get all these pigeons. Pigeons, that's the word. I knew it started with a P. Pigeons. There are all these fancy pigeons. And some of the ones that people showed, they have all this fancy plumage. And you look at the different variety of pigeons. It's like the different variety of dogs. They look so different from each other. And yet they obviously all started from the same pigeon. Or the dog all started from the same domesticated wolf, Okay, so these ideas were in Darwin's mind, and when he went around the world and collected all these specimens, and as I said, the Galapagos Islands were a wonderful place to visit because of the incredible variety of these various organisms that all live on these islands. Same kind, but different species, And he's going, wow, how did this happen? Okay, other kinds of things that were happening. Charles Lyell wrote a book called The Principles of Geology. And the idea about that, well, let me put it this way. Before people like the geologists were talking about these things, they pretty much thought, hey, the Earth is the way it was always. It's always been that way, And what Lyell showed is, there have been all these different geological processes at work, and they're still at work, and they cause change. There's all kinds of change in the Earth. It's constantly happening. In other words, the Earth wasn't formed originally with the Himalayas being these tall mountains, No, there have been all kinds of changes. This is before they knew about geological plates and, how the Earth's crust moves, by the way. It's quite a bit before that. But the point is that he said, hey, there are all kinds of changes that occur, and they're still occurring. So it's not like the Earth is static. And yet that's what people thought at the time. Why not? You feel you're standing here on the Earth, it doesn't change much. But there is all kinds of change. Now we in this, in the West Coast here, we know about earthquakes, that's for sure. but still, they didn't know how earthquakes occurred, and they didn't know the kinds of changes that earthquakes would cause, except for destruction, perhaps. Okay, so Lyle was talking about that. I'll come back to Lamarck in just a second. This is actually kind of important. Cuvier said that he talked about catastrophes, and he said, there have been various catastrophes. And his idea was that catastrophes would wipe out all the living things on Earth, and they'd all start over again. Now, that's not the case that everything starts over again, but he's right. They didn't know at the time, but catastrophes had a big effect on life on Earth. And you all know about the destruction of the dinosaurs, which they now attribute to huge meteor that fell in the Yucatan area,
But didn't they? There was something about dinosaurs, different types of dinosaurs dying off at different times.
Yeah. I mean, it wasn't like it, happened in one moment. I mean, we're still talking thousands of year process. By the way, just out of curiosity, some of the reptiles, the amount of light, the temperature, especially temperature, can have an effect on what sexes are born. And so, that if it's particularly cold, for example, with maybe turtles, more males will be born. If there's more females, or vice versa. I don't remember which. But the point is that things like there can be various effects on what genders are actually
prevalent.
And if you did have some giant meteor landing in the ocean or the Gulf of Mexico, and it causes so much junk in the air that it knocks out the sun's light from doing photosynthesis, for a number of months. It can certainly cool things down, the vegetation can change, and you can imagine there could be a big destruction of organisms, You wouldn't necessarily predict it would wipe out something like the dinosaurs, and of course, as I said, it didn't happen just immediately. It wasn't like, one flash of
well, it was a big blast.
But and if you were nearby, you would have
ground zero. You're not.
But I mean, I'm talking about animals, organisms, thousands of miles away. It wasn't direct; it was indirect because of things that blocking out the sunlight. Even in the 1600s, there was a certain year, and I don't remember the year, in which they had no summer, and I forget what it was. I think it was a big volcano. And the volcano spewed out so much junk into the air that it knocked out the sunlight for the entire summer in Europe. So for the entire summer, the sun would come up, but it was, you didn't see much sunlight because it was being blocked out by all this junk in the air.
Vesuvius?
So that was just one little summer. Here we're talking about something like and lasting many, 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 many years longer than just one summer. So the point is that what Cuvier pointed out was, hey, there is a lot of things change. I mean, that's what Cuvier said. Charles Lyell said. There's a lot of change going on. Cuvier said, hey, there's destruction. Actually, as it turns out, he didn't necessarily know all this at the time because they were just starting to seize fossils and dig them up and try to understand them. But there have been at least two major, huge extinction events that have occurred in the history of life on Earth. And the one where the dinosaurs died off, that was one, and there was another one. And again, they don't know exactly why these things necessarily happen, but they apparently have happened. And various catastrophes that have occurred. And anyway, let me talk a little bit about Lamarck as a lead-in to talking about Darwin and his theory of natural selection, because Lamarck is famous. He was a good scientist. It's kind of funny. People kind of laugh at him in a way now because his mechanism is the wrong mechanism for evolution. Well, that's okay. He was a good scientist, and just because his ideas weren't correct, that's okay. He did some good work. But Lamarck, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, I didn't give you his whole name, did I? But Lamarck oops, okay. He had his idea of he believed in the inheritance of acquired characteristics. Characteristics. Inheritance of acquired characteristics. Now the usual way they talk about this. You see that better. Inheritance of acquired characteristics. The picture that they often give, I'll give you the same picture, but we can talk about other ones also. Giraffes. They have a long neck. Now, presumably, they didn't start out with the precursor animal, however many hundreds of thousands, millions of years ago, didn't have such a long neck. So Lamarck pictured these giraffes on like the African savanna, eating maybe leaves off acacia trees or something like that. Well, if you have a whole bunch of giraffes with the same length neck and they're all eating these leaves, pretty soon they're going to run out of leaves, right? They're going to overeat their food supply. But some of the leaves are higher up. And so Lamarck says, well, what probably happened was these guys that were, there wasn't enough food, and they were stretching their necks to reach up higher. And by stretching their necks, they made their necks longer. And so as this happened over a period of, maybe several thousand years or whatever, they ended up with longer necks. It seemed plausible at the time. It's not, it's not like it was a totally dumb idea if you don't know anything about genetics. And of course, they didn't know anything about genetics, and so, but this is the idea of acquired characteristics. Or, what if you learn to play the piano really well? Okay, then your kids should be able to play the piano really well because they're going to inherit your acquired characteristics, your ability to play the piano really well. Well, we know there aren't genes for playing the piano. Piano playing genes, that's not the way it is. That's an acquired characteristic, and so you don't pass on your piano playing ability to your kids through your genes. But they didn't know that in those days. So anyway, so that was the idea of what Lamarck said. The reason I'm telling you a little bit about that, first of all, it's important in terms of the history of theories of evolution and mechanism. And this would be a mechanism of evolution. You inherit these acquired characteristics. What we're going to find interesting, I think, is very interesting. I think you'll find it interesting that Lamarckian form of inheritance is the way cultural evolution works. And for humans, we're talking for humans, is a big deal. And when I talk cultural evolution, I'm talking about things like we don't have to reinvent the wheel every generation. You look at a computer today. And, if say 100 years ago, if someone could show you this computer, you'd go, it's magic. Yeah. How can it do all those things? It's absolutely magic. It didn't start out like this. It started out with, Marconi sending a signal back and forth, and then people started developing all kinds of, eventually, vacuum tubes and stuff like that. When I was young, and they were first developing computers, the ENIAC and UNIVAC and whatever, they used vacuum tubes, these huge tubes, and the computer was about the size of this room, and it doesn't have the power that a laptop has. It didn't have the power, the memory, or anything else that a laptop has now. But that's because of the technology. The technology has been developing over a period of years.
The on-off switch got smaller.
The on-off switch got less. We have these integrated circuits,
ICs,
chips, and before that they had transistors, and before that the vacuum tubes. And,
my dad did all that.
And it was, it was just such a huge, remarkable change. And that's only been, well, I think Marconi was what was he, early 1900s, 1909. So say roughly 100 years, we go from first sending a radio signal back and forth to having these computers that are incredible in terms of what they can do. Now, that's 100 years. That's quick. That's incredibly quick. And same thing if you want to talk about traveling. 100 years ago, people were riding their horse and
horse and carriage. The scientific method is really powerful.
We sent rockets out to outer space. I mean, so the things have just changed remarkably. But that's cultural evolution, and that does happen in a Lamarckian way. And we'll come back to this idea later. I don't want to talk about this now. I want to come back to it. But I'm pointing out that I don't want to laugh at Lamarck's ideas. They were not correct for organic evolution. But if we're talking about humans and cultural evolution, it is the mechanism.
Is part of this theory also that like the ones with the longer necks were more likely to survive, so they're more likely
That's
to
natural
Right,
selection.
and that's what I'm going to come back to
Yeah.
with Darwin in a minute. Yeah, I do want. I'll come back with the idea of the
Shaped
giraffes
by the
and why they have
environment.
long necks. Yes, in a couple minutes. I wasn't going to neglect that. I was just getting there. yeah, absolutely. But anyway, okay, so let's go to one more thing. Malthus wrote an essay. It was a famous essay, and Darwin read it. But it was a famous. He was a preacher, but he wrote this famous essay that I say it became famous, dealing with populations and food supply. And his basic premise was that the population of organisms, we'll say animals, make it easier to talk about, but the population of animals will increase faster than the food supply. Okay? So this is an idea that was in, Darwin understood because he had read that essay. He had gone on this trip in the Beagle where he collected all kinds of specimens. He'd seen all kinds of change, in terms of organisms. He had all these samples that he brought home. He was doing experiments with barnacles and stuff like that. He had all these things, and he had, he knew a lot of people in the field, and so he was developing this theory of natural selection, which we're going to talk about.
When is the essay by Malthus written?
Oh, I can't remember. I think it was in the 1830s or 40s, but I can't remember the exact year. I don't. Maybe I have it on my. Let me see if I might have it in my notes, but I don't remember offhand.
But not like.
I don't have the written.
It's not Greek or Roman or anything.
Oh no. He was
Contemporary
yeah, he was
somewhere.
English.
Okay.
Now, by the way, keep in mind that when Darwin actually published the ideas of what was I trying to say? The genetics, the information about genes and all that had been published by Mendel. But remember, it was kind of in an obscure journal and hadn't been read by very many people. And if Darwin had read Mendel's work and all that, he would have been better able to develop his theory because no one knew anything about genetics at the time. But anyway, back to where we were. So all these things are going through Darwin's mind. He's developing the theories, his theory of natural selection, which we're going to talk about. But he was delaying publishing his works. And a lot of it was the fact that his ideas didn't involve a creator. In other words, everything he said could occur without there being a creator. He knew that this was going to disturb a lot of people, because most people in Britain at the time were religious. Even his wife, she was very religious. And he was religious to begin with, but he just realized that the way things are,
he knew what happened to his predecessors.
Require a creator. That you don't have to hypothesize a creator to have everything go the way it does. So he was delaying publishing. In the meantime, Alfred Russel Wallace is a famous scientist also. He was, I don't know, I forget where he was, somewhere in Africa or somewhere. He was doing some research on some biological work. He got some terrible fever. He was kind of out of it for several days, sort of delirious and everything. And then as he was coming back to reality and everything, he was thinking about various things. This brilliant idea hit him. this idea of natural selection. This idea, and he knew Darwin was well known at the time, and he knew that Darwin was interested in the same ideas. So he wrote a letter to Darwin, said, "I've got some really good ideas. I'd like you, because he's writing from like Africa, I think it was, or South America. I think it was Africa. And he said, I'd like you to present it at the next meeting of the Royal Society." And oh my God, Darwin looks at this and he goes, "These are exactly my ideas too, but I've never published." So, and he went to his friends, various friends of his, and he said, "What should I do?" And they said, "Well, you quickly write up your ideas. We'll give them both to the Royal Society at the same time." So they did. I mean, and so both people were, had their ideas presented at the same time. Darwin's given the main, he's sort of the main one because he had been dealing with this for a number of years. He had all kinds of evidence. He collected all kinds of information. But again, he fully recognized Wallace's ideas, and I think they were very generous towards each other. And Wallace clearly recognized Darwin as his predecessor in the ideas. But it was just kind of neat that they both kind of came up with the ideas at the same time.
Mhm.
Well, not quite at the same time, but it was published at the same time. So let's actually talk about some of these ideas. So let's talk about the theory of natural selection, because this is, as I say, this is the mechanism for evolution. This again, it's not, Darwin didn't come up with the idea of evolution. As I said, it's been around for thousands of years. He came up with a plausible mechanism, and like any good scientific idea, you come up with an idea that allows you to ask questions, and then you can try to do experiments, and then you try to see how they work. In the case of evolution, it's not as easy to do experiments that go up in time. It's easier to go back in time, meaning you collect evidence like fossils, and that's one of the things for the evidence. There's a lot of fossil work. Now, of course, not available in Darwin's day. There's a lot of DNA work that we can do. There's a lot of other kinds of things that we can do that weren't able to be done by Darwin. But still, the point is, it's a scientific idea, so you can actually ask questions. You can look for the answers experimentally and all that. All right, so let's talk about this. So, theory of natural selection is a mechanism for evolution. It's cold outside, there's room in here. So is that right? Part way, you guys?
You're fine.
Okay, so what we're looking, the idea of evolution really refers to descent with modification. Let me put this down here. Evolution is descent with modification. So I'll come back to this. I thought I better say this first. Descent with modification. Change over time. And what we're saying now, this isn't the way Darwin would have said it, because he wasn't aware of genetics. But what we would say now is change in gene frequencies in a population. This is a simple definition: change in gene frequencies. In a population.
Due to environment, right?
Well, so the environment we're going to see when we talk about natural selection. Obviously, the environment is very important because
shapes us.
That's what's deciding who's going to survive.
But yeah,
And by the way, the lab that you're doing this week is a fun lab because you're simulating natural selection, and you're simulating it just in the classroom with predators and prey.
are we
The
killing that stuff?
predators are, well, the prey are beans, okay, different colored beans, red and brown and black and white beans. You can put them in this mixture of dirt and vermiculite and all that. And the prey will be you guys holding on to various ways of catching the beans, fork, a spoon, a knife, and forceps. And then you're going to actually try to capture the prey in a given amount of time. And you know the predators that survive the predators that are the most efficient are going to reproduce. The prey that are the best at surviving will be able to duplicate themselves more easily. Anyway, you'll do it. And it's actually, it sounds kind of funny, you know. It's a fun experiment to run. It actually is kind of a fun one. Then you get the whole idea is to simulate what's happening in the real world in terms of environment and survivability. And that's what we're going to talk about. But let me just come back to this in a second. So in a simple definition of evolution is change in gene frequencies in a population over time. Did I put over time? Let's say over time. Okay. And of course, we're not talking short amounts of time. That's the thing I'm trying to stress when I talk about the evolution of the computer. You know,
that's
from
short.
the
Yeah.
first the first radio signal. You know, we're talking 100 years, say. That's a very short amount of time in evolution. That's not even a blip on the radar screen of evolution.
No.
You know, evolution requires hundreds and hundreds of thousands of years. You know, usually we're thinking millions of years. Keep in mind that the dinosaurs died off 65 million years ago, right? And they always say that it was the dinosaurs dying off that allowed the mammals at the time, the few mammals that were there, to start increasing in numbers because they weren't being eaten up by all these nasty dinosaurs. Not all the dinosaurs were nasty, by the way. That's just things like the Tyrannosaurus and everything. I mean, most of those dinosaurs were herbivores themselves and were prey. But anyway, the point is that once the big nasty predators were gone, that it allowed some of the little mammals to survive, and here we are.
Have you seen the entire 13.8 billion years compressed into a single year on the cosmos?
I haven't, but that would be a good thing.
It's so cool.
And the reason, one thing to think about is, of course, if you're talking about just Earth, 4.5 billion years old, and
yeah,
we've had life on Earth for at least 3 billion, maybe 3.5 billion years. Humans are just barely, right
7 seconds,
yes,
or last 15 seconds.
So, I mean, it's just we've just barely been here at all. And my favorite cartoon was Calvin and Hobbes. It's the greatest cartoon. I was so sorry when the guy decided to quit doing it. I'm sure it was a tough thing to continue doing because he was brilliant with those things. But one of my favorites was Calvin going, "Here I am, the acme of evolution."
Yeah.
And of course Hobbes, his tiger friend, goes, "I think you're talking about tigers because tigers eat people." Then they have the big fight as usual. But anyway, but the point is that what we're really talking about in evolution is change over time. And if there's sufficient change within, let's just say there's a population of organisms that's changing, and maybe they get separated, for example. And I'll show you some better ideas than just this. But separated or continue to change but in different ways, then these organisms versus these organisms may not be able to get together and reproduce. And if that's the case, then it looks like they're separating what we would now call different species. Okay? And so change in gene frequencies in the population over time, I'll say which can lead to new species. All right. So let's talk about the theory of natural selection. this mechanism, as I said. So 4 basic ideas. There's variation in the gene pool. We've been talking about that, of course, in the last couple of lectures. There's variation in the gene pool. By the way, just to make sure that I'm using the word in a way that you understand it, when we say the gene pool, if I talk about the gene pool of humans, it means all the genes that are present in the human population at the moment. And most of the genes, as I've said, we share, but there's different varieties of some of these genes. That's why we have different colored hair and different height and different varieties. But there's everything from like being albinism, some of the things you did in the lab. That's one unusual kind of thing. Sickle cell anemia, that's one of those unusual kind of genes. But those are parts of the gene pool. They may be in small numbers. Those genes may not be very common in the gene pool, but they're there. And of course, what are we talking about in terms of evolution? Change in the gene frequencies. And we're going to come back to that in just a second. So there's variation in the gene pool, and I should make this not finish by saying, and this variation is heritable. It's heritable because we're talking genes, right? The variation is due to what genes you have and the way they're expressed. But what's heritable, of course, genes. So the variation is heritable. Okay. Number 2. Their struggle for survival. That goes back to Malthus's essay that more organisms are born or occur than can possibly survive, and so not every organism is surviving. In fact, most of them aren't surviving, and so only certain ones will survive. But they're struggle for survival, and those organisms with those variations that give them the best advantage to survive, their survival more likely as opposed to some others, those are the ones that will survive, and they'll reproduce, so that the variations that are allowing them to survive will be passed on. I'm going to write all this down. Not in all those words, but a lot of words. Okay, so they're a struggle for survival, and those organisms with the favorable variations. Now I'm going to come back to the draft now. With the favorable variations.
Did I use the word mutation?
Well, we'll come to mutations in a minute. We'll come back to it. In some cases, mutations gives more variety, in the gene pool. And so occasionally the mutations are useful. Yeah, we'll come back to that.
Okay.
But so their struggle for survival, and those organisms with the favorable variations which allow them to survive, allowing them to survive, are the ones that do survive and reproduce.
Causing those to dominate the gene pool.
So those variations that are useful will start increasing in the gene pool. Change in gene frequency. Those useful variations, those useful genes will start increasing in frequency. Anyway, so let me write this down. And those organisms with the favorable variations allowing them to survive are the ones that survive and reproduce. Now, this is often referred to as differential reproductive success. Okay? Let me write that down. I'm putting it in red letters so you can see it. Differential reproductive success. Differential just means difference. Just, so certain organisms are surviving better than the other organisms. Now, we're not done yet. I'm going to have 4 different things up here, but just stopping for the moment and thinking about those, the giraffes. So go back to the giraffe population, and most of them are roughly the same height, or have the same length neck, but some are a little bit longer neck, some are a little bit shorter neck. They're that way already. Not because they're pushing to, stretch their neck. There are already some that have longer necks because that's just part of the variation. Just in humans, we're not all the same height. Some humans are taller, some are shorter. And so the same thing with giraffes. Some giraffes have longer necks, some have shorter necks. And if all the lower leaves get eaten and only there's not very much food left over, but it's higher up, then only those giraffes with the longer necks might be able to reach those upper leaves. And so those guys are going to survive in greater numbers and reproduce, and most likely their offspring will have a little bit longer necks. And if this keeps happening over generation after generation after generation, pretty soon, a long time from now, not pretty soon, but after a long period of time, you'll have a whole population of giraffes with very long necks, much longer necks than the original giraffes they started from. Does that make sense? So that's all part of the so-called differential reproductive success. And again, that differential, that whole idea there's a difference, that those are surviving and reproducing in greater numbers, and slowly, long time, there is a change in the gene frequencies for those traits that allow this organism to survive better. Okay, number 3, and that's going along with this, the offspring of these more fit individuals surviving individuals, and they're surviving because they're slightly more fit, of these surviving individuals, will inherit these favorable traits. The offspring of these surviving individuals will inherit these favorable traits, allowing them to survive. This is that descent with modification. So I'm going to put that in red here also. With modification. And then the last thing is, eventually, if enough changes occur, what I said earlier, is that will allow new species to develop. Eventually, with enough change, new species can develop. Or will develop. Again, it doesn't happen overnight. We're talking a long period of time. And when Darwin looked at the finches in Galapagos Islands, or the tortoises or whatever, he realized these all. And by the way, at this particular time, I think when he's in the Galapagos, I don't think those tortoises are interbreeding. I don't think the finches are interbreeding. I think they're only interbreeding with those on the same island, so the different island ones aren't. Which meant, if I'm correct about that, it meant that there was enough time that these organisms, were isolated from each other, and we actually call it reproductive isolation. They got to the point where they've changed enough that they can't reproduce, they can't interbreed anymore. Anyway, so the point is that you know they are actual new species. Okay.
And this is because of niches, or this
In a sense.
it was Darwin that kind of coined that whole idea of there's as the giraffe's necks got longer, there were some of the lower leaves they were no longer able to eat, and then
some other organism might have
come in and filled. Yeah.
I mean, you've seen pictures of giraffes trying to drink water, and it's not convenient. They put their arms
That's what I'm saying. There's stuff they couldn't get anymore. So.
But anyway, but the point is that and now keep in mind, this is with a particular environment. If suddenly the environment changes, it may be that these particular traits that were favorable may not be favorable anymore. And of course, the example we can give, the really easy example for humans, one example we can give was that sickle cell anemia. That in general, sickle cell anemia, if you inherit one gene, obviously if you inherit two genes for it, you don't survive. But if you inherit one gene, that's not good because occasionally you might have some of these sickle cell crises. So you wouldn't, that wouldn't be a good mutation to have because it probably started by just a chance mutation. But if you're in the environment of malaria and it gives you an advantage to survive malaria, then you have a better chance of surviving. So so you can see that if the environment changes, there'd be different, what we would call selective pressure, which organisms can survive this new environment versus the previous environment. And who knows what the environment's going to be like. I mean, we think of things being pretty stable, but it isn't always the case. Things can change. So this is the basic idea then of the theory of natural selection. So this is where what Darwin came up with. But what I want to do a little bit about is talk about some of the evidence for evolution. Actually, let me give you another idea of. I talked about how you can get how you can get new environments, for example, and how two populations might be separated from each other. An example I sometimes give is, maybe you have an ant colony or something, and then some stream suddenly comes in and divides that ant colony into two groups. So you have two groups on two sides of the stream, and the ants don't swim well, so they don't cross the stream. In that case, the ants on one side of the stream will be changing over time, depending upon what it's like on that one side, and ones on the other side will be changing on their own. And it could be after enough hundreds of thousands of years they've changed sufficiently that if they did get together, I'm not interested in those. Now, granted, ants are a little different because most of them are workers; they don't breed. But if you understand the point I'm trying to make, so that's one way that you can get populations to be kind of broken up from each other. Or even have a group of organisms that just kind of wander off into another area and all that. That can happen. You can get organisms like the tortoises on the Galapagos Islands. They may have hitched a ride on some floating log or something. Who knows how some of these organisms got from one place to another. And birds, you understand, they fly. Sometimes something swims well enough they can get there. But sometimes you'll say, how do these organisms get there? A lot of times it's just by chance. But let me give you some evidence for evolution, just some ideas. Some of this evidence Darwin developed and collected and all that, and some, of course, is more modern. He didn't know about it, and it's too bad he didn't because he would have loved it if he'd known about genetics. Because back in those days, remember, they didn't know. They thought that the characteristics of two organisms kind of blended, in the blood maybe. That's what they thought. They didn't know. No one knew. But anyway, so let's talk about some evidence. So we'll talk about that under evidence for evolution. Things like genetics. What we know about genetics now, and how genes are transmitted. And of course, going back to Mendel. It was a big surprise when Mendel took like a tall plant and a short plant. He interbred them, and you got all tall plants. And then when he did a cross with those hybrids, he got some short plants back again. That was a big surprise because before that, people were predicting now they're all, you got rid of whatever that small plant was, they're all going to be tall. But they, it wasn't until Mendel showed that, hey, well, genes are some kind of a particular thing. We now know what it is, but they didn't know. There's some kind of a particular thing that didn't necessarily just disappear, that it might not be showing up in this one situation, but it might show up in another situation. We know about the homozygous recessive now, but they didn't know about those things until Mendel did the work. So these modern ideas of genetics help understand more about how these variations are transmitted. By the way, they often refer to evolution as survival or natural selection, survival of the fittest. And Darwin didn't say that, and he didn't come up with a term. It actually comes from a poem, and I can't remember the poem right now, but it says, "Nature red in tooth and claw," and it's talking about the survival, the predators going after the prey, and so it sounds really dramatic, what you see in a movie, or the dinosaurs coming after you or something. But a better way would be the survival of the more fit. It's not like, this organism is perfectly fit for its environment. Or certain ones that are fantastically fit. They're a little bit more fit. Natural selection doesn't make a perfect organism. It's selecting for those organisms that are more fit for the environment and are better able to survive. And there may be quite a few different varieties that are a little better able to survive. So anyway, so modern genetics helps us understand how these variations can be passed along. One of the important things that started happening in the middle 1800s and from then on were fossils. People started finding fossils, and so fossils, they show change over time. And this is kind of wild because, when they first found fossils, it was kind of like, whoa, what are these things? And they found things like shells up on the top of mountains, and people are going, how did shells get to the top of the mountain? Well, either the seas were very high back then, or more likely the
ground was lower.
The ground was lower, and but they didn't know about plates, and pushing up and making mountains forming. We understand modern geology now, but anyway, the point is that but if you look at fossils, and there's a series of fossils, and you can see how animals change over time by doing. And by the way, when people do their digs, they're incredibly careful. In the old days, they would just dig and find out what they could find. Now they're incredibly careful to get things at different levels and catalog everything and say what level it is, so they can actually look at the way things change, the way an organism changes over time. So they're very sophisticated now in the way they collect them, the way they organize them, the way they classify them. Yeah.
Have you ever been to La Brea Tarpets?
I haven't. It's something I wanted to do, but the La Brea Tarpets down in the LA area, where there are all kinds of organisms that fall into these things and then just get preserved. And then they've been
sort of.
Something I've wanted to do, I just haven't yet. Yeah.
They've the tarpets. I always thought it was fake.
Oh well, I
thought they just recreated.
Some of it is.
They don't. They may or may not
But
have the actual skeletons there. It depends upon
they
the
do.
skeleton and how much they have. Some of it they may have redone this. Like they've made a fake skeleton just to show you what was found. In other cases, they might have the real one. And it all
there's
depends
a lot
on
of some of that
they
stuff.
have and how what kind of state it's in. If it's kind of delicate, they don't want to put it out there where somebody might bump into it. I haven't seen it, But yeah, no, I know it. It's great. I sometimes use a shampoo that has tar in it.
Yes.
And I always claim that when I shampoo with it, I smell like a La Brea Tarpet. Or at least I hope I do. I don't know.
No.
What do I?
They don't.
It doesn't smell like anything.
Oh darn.
No.
Anyway, the tarpets don't.
It just looks like a part.
Oh yeah. But,
And there's a huge museum and all this stuff.
The tar itself, the original stuff was probably fairly.
I saw it when I was 12. I grew up in LA.
I haven't been, but whatever. But yeah, this stuff's great. And the fossil record is very incomplete because what are the chances, first of all, of something fossilizing, because most of the time when something dies, some organism dies, it just deteriorates and is gone. And especially if it's got a soft body, if it's an invertebrate, like a worm or something, it's not going to fossilize properly. But if it's bone can last. But even still, most of these things just get totally broken up over time and they're gone and everything. But in certain cases, like the tar pits where the animals fell in and just got trapped, or in other cases, where maybe there's a landslide and it just landed on a whole bunch of animals, and so then they were trapped and died, and they were all in one place, or they fell into the some part of an ocean or something. There's a famous one in Burgess Shale up in British Columbia, just a chance preservation, beautiful preservation of invertebrates, not vertebrates, but invertebrates, and it was like 600,000 years ago. And this is kind of the precursor of all the animals since then. It's kind of amazing. But it was just a chance preservation which someone discovered. And so, the fact that fossils are just a chance event, and I can tell you, scientists who study these things would love to have more fossils. And they look for them. And they keep finding them all the time, and
Utah.
The more they find, the better the record gets as far as trying to understand how things have changed over time. And I'm not thinking just of humans. We will talk about human evolution, I think, next time. And that's interesting in its own right. But, we're kind of self-centered. We just sort of think of humans are the afternoon of evolution. But
It's human arrogance, as Spock calls it.
That's right. It's human arrogance. That's right. Spock didn't like that, right?
No.
Vulcans were different. Anyway, one of the things that they do is they want to know, when they find fossils, they want to know how long ago they lasted. So they use a lot of radioactive dating to try to understand what the age relationships are. And actually, they do a series of different kinds of things. Now they do radioactive dating, but the weird thing is that they've discovered that nucleic acids, especially DNA, is a lot more stable than they thought. And they can sometimes get some DNA from certain kinds of things that have been fossilized, or at least preserved, but many thousands of years old, plants or something like that. They can actually extract some of the DNA and find out what the genes, some of the genes are, not a complete thing. But, it's kind of wild to think that they actually get some genes out of these things.
That's from the amber, a lot of it.
And the amber is kind of an interesting one because amber, which is fossilized tree resin,
sap, yeah.
Tree sap, and every so often you'll get organisms like a mosquito.
Mosquito.
Like that trapped in it. And what they keep hoping, and this is the whole idea of what was
Jurassic Park.
Yeah. What they keep hoping is that they'll get some piece of amber with some mosquito that just before it died, it had, maybe
got
bitten
blood.
the eyelid of or something like that.
A Tyrannosaurus Rex.
Tyrannosaurus or something.
Brontosaur.
And then they could extract some DNA from the inside of the gut of that mosquito and maybe get some. I mean, you couldn't get a whole genome that way, but you could get pieces.
And if you get enough of
kind
them,
of
you
a
might be
wild
able to
idea
put
to
it
think
together.
about.
Yeah, that's the idea.
But it's not an impossibility.
No,
It's
that's the scary part.
possible, but a chance. That'd be pure chance. Yeah.
I think that they were talking about being able to tell like a woolly mammoth.
Yeah,
yeah.
But see, with woolly mammoths, they actually, they have preserved specimens in the permafrost and all that, and they have one little baby and stuff. And so they're hoping to get the genes, and then try to somehow manipulate it so they can actually get an organism. Put it in a elephant cell, and then have an elephant give birth to it. So replace the elephant's genes with maybe this woolly mammoth, so we'll give birth to a woolly mammoth. Well, how would that elephant feel? Somebody giving birth to a woolly mammoth.
Yeah.
What? Wait, what happened?
Yeah. How'd
wrong here, folks? But anyway, but I mean, it's a fascinating idea that they could possibly do this.
Since they got an artificial cell and we figured out we can introduce DNA that works, we can do it. So yeah.
If you get enough of the genes and stuff like that.
As of 2 weeks, 3 weeks
and
ago.
And they're thinking about that with, if they could get some of the genes of some of the reptiles that are from the dinosaur age, maybe put a few of those genes into lizards or something.
So we could
how
ride
far
to
they could
school
carry
on a
this, I don't
raptor.
know. Well, you have to be careful in some of the experiments, as that book showed.
Yeah.
Or the movie. I mean, it was pretty scary movie actually. Some other things they use: comparative embryology, comparative morphology. Comparative embryology. And comparative morphology. Let's take those words. Embryology. That's just the development of embryos, through the organism that comes out, whatever. We could be talking about birds or mammals or whatever. But it's interesting if you look at the embryos of various vertebrates. Take humans, for example. Just take humans. And you look at some of the stages of the embryo. There's a time during the embryonic development of humans where we have gill slits.
Yeah.
Okay. Which, fishes and all that have. They have gill slits, right? Because they're swimming underwater here. They have to breathe underwater. But those gill slits in the land mammals, they go away. Yeah.
Have you seen where they compare the stages of the human embryo developing to the leech?
To the leech.
Yeah,
We don't want to be compared to a leech.
No,
I'm
like
just teasing you. But
the
yeah.
different stages, it's
Yeah.
almost like they can't. It's like an X-ray,
At certain
they can't tell
times,
the difference.
that's right. At certain times, it's very similar. And so, there are various other stages of embryonic development that harken back to earlier stages of that organism's existence. Now, here's a great word. I'm going to give you this expression, and you can wow your friends with this expression, and I'll tell you what it means. I remember they first gave this when I was in college, but they never really explained it. So, but this is next time you're at a party, you can ask this question of somebody, and of course they may not talk to you after this, they may just walk away and that'll be it. But you're going to say, I'm going to say it right. I'm going to say it. Just a minute. It's going to be, recapitulate biology, ontogeny, here we have it. Does ontogeny recapitulate, isn't this great? Recapitulate phylogeny. So, so if you're at a party, you say, now, tell me, do you think that it's true that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny? And they're probably going to go, what have you been smoking anyway? But anyway.
Ontogeny, the cause of
But
something.
what are we talking about here? First of all, phylogeny. Phylogeny talks about how the phyla, the various phyla, have changed over time. The fishes. Well, we go back further than fishes, but let's just say from fishes and amphibians to reptiles to mammals or something like that. So that progression of the animals in terms of their phyla, and you can start back at the leech if you want. I mean, you can go that far back. So that's what we're talking about. Phylogeny is the change of all these phyla over a long period of time. Recapitulate means to redo it, redo it. And ontogeny is talking about embryonic development. So does embryonic development show, as it goes along, all the different levels of phyla development, the development of organisms. So, in other words, they say, well, here's an example of it. Those gill slits in a human, that's an example of some ontogeny, at least showing some earlier phylogeny relationship, phylogenetic relationship.
Which is kind of proof that we do come from single-celled organisms originally.
I mean, that's going way far back. Yeah. But the point is that the answer is no, it doesn't really recapitulate.
It wasn't the I Dream of Jeannie Blink
certainly
from
there are remains in our ontological development
But do you know
that
how
show phylogenetic changes from way back when. But it's not a simple, yes, right, straight on through. Yeah.
The comparison that they found
With a leech.
was through the Bible. They went back
Through
to
the Bible.
Yeah, that's where they found the description through the
Oh.
Quran, where God's words
Yeah.
describe, because they're trying to disprove the Bible, and they show that was so long ago that no one else could have said it but him, and that's where they got the comparison, and they literally show each comparison, like from the Bible describing each,
Funny.
like from a biology book now.
Yeah.
They're saying that there's no way that that's where they got the comparison.
I would have to check that out.
A lot of the Bible is
Like a
selective
Bible.
reading. What
But
you
anyway,
hear.
But the point is that's a funny.
If you read carefully, he was not a
See
virgin.
this expression. That's what they're talking about in terms of the development. Development is recapitulating the way the animals evolved over time. It's not quite that simple, but it's kind of cool. But comparative embryology does show you that there's a lot of relationships between whether we're talking birds and mammals and reptiles. There's a lot of similarity in that development, which does show that vertebrates did evolve, with some original kind of vertebrate way back when. Comparative morphology, again, you look at the difference. Morphology means structure, shape, structure. Okay, that's what that means, shape or structure. You look at like the skeleton of vertebrates. So similar, Obviously, there are differences in them because of the animals have a different existence, as far as what they're doing. But still, the 5 fingers and the 2 sets of legs. And you look at something like a whale. A lot of whales have the bones, the hip, and the bones of what would be legs. They don't have legs, but they have the rudimentary bones where the legs would have been. And what they say happened with whales. I mean, originally animals evolved in the sea. They later came on land, but apparently the whales were animals that went back into the sea after they'd been on land. So that's why they have the 4 legs. The fishes don't have the 4 legs, Anyway, so it's kind of wild that so the comparative morphology is kind of an interesting thing. Other things that can help show this is called biogeography. Looking at the different organisms, animals, or plants. I mean, I keep saying animals, but don't forget we're talking about plants too. Around the world. And kind of an interesting one, of course, is the placental mammals and the pouched mammals, the marsupials. And pretty much now, marsupials are mainly in Australia and a few islands nearby. We do have possum. In North and South America. I think those are the only mammals. But what apparently happened, so if you went to Australia and say, my God, look at all these pouched mammals. They didn't have any mammals, any placental mammals until humans went there. They just had the pouched mammals. And so, and then you say, well, wait, what happened? But then you can find fossils of these pouched mammals in North and South America. Mm-hmm. And what they think happened, just for interest's sake, was that originally there were probably pouched mammals a lot in South America, and then as things changed and North and South America joined, there apparently were a lot of placental mammals, carnivores, that were in North America who came down to Central America and went into South America and wiped out all the pouched mammals there, except for the possum. But the ones in Australia, of course, have been separated because that part separates. So
is that why the possum learned to play dead?
Some had to learn somewhere, sometime, and seems to survive pretty well, But anyway, so looking at that's called biogeography, where you're looking at organisms. It doesn't have to be just animals, but whatever, and their distribution around the world. How did that distribution occur? And it didn't happen like it just all of a sudden. It had to happen over a period of long time. Another interesting fact is that there's the same genetic code in all organisms.
So the nitrogenous base is the same through all of them.
Yeah. I mean, this is kind of if you look at it that and you go, whoa, I mean, if you just were thinking about it in general without knowing much about it, why would there have to, you could think that animals and plants could have totally different genetic codes. They could have totally different genes and all that. But I have the same genetic code with other animals. We share all kinds of the same genes. I mean, when they found out that we share a lot of the same genes with the fruit fly, a lot of humans were a little upset about that. They didn't think we should share very much. But there are all kinds of genes that are important just in terms of development. That doesn't say that it's, fruit fly or a human. It's just in terms of development. We have all kinds of genes that are different that make us humans. I mean, I'm a human. I told you this before. I'm glad I'm a human, but I don't want to say that because I'm a human, I'm the best animal on earth. I'm just one of the multitudes of organisms in this biosphere. I happen to like being a human, and I happen to like the fact that we can do what we can do. We have computers and everything else. But your dogs seem to get along just fine without using the computer. I mean, I don't know. They seem pretty happy. All you do is give it food and love, and it's happy. So
they do want to drive though sometimes.
They what?
They want to drive sometimes.
Yeah. Sometimes they want to drive. We can do all kinds of experiments now that we didn't used to be able to do. But and this is all, it's all kinds of. This is just some of the what we would call evidence for evolution. The biggest hurdle is trying to understand how all this happened, and is happening, although we can't see it, is time. And keep in mind that for about 3 billion years, most organisms on Earth were single-celled. And somehow in the last 600 million years, roughly, that Burgess Shale, those organisms they found in that Burgess Shale kind of show some of the beginnings. Multicellular life started to flourish. And it just has flourished now until we have what we have. And it's a very rich life. Now, that's 600 million years. Keep in mind that dinosaurs died off like 65 million years ago, and mammals have been really proliferating since then. Humans have been on this planet for just a short amount of time. Modern humans, really for the last 250,000 years or so. Yeah. And the big change in humans seems to have been around 40,000 years ago. We'll talk about that, I think, next lecture. They call it the Great Leap Forward. We'll talk about what maybe happened. We don't know. A lot of this is guesswork, but it's wild, interesting, and good stuff. The other thing to keep in mind is that humans, I mentioned this once before to you, but humans have had big shocks to their system over the last just a few hundred years. Because up until a few hundred years ago, a couple hundred years ago, we were obviously the greatest creatures on Earth, and we thought, in the universe, we were the center of the universe. And, then it was Copernicus who showed that, oh my gosh, the Earth isn't the center of the universe. It's not even the center of the solar system. The sun is the center of the solar system, and it's just one little solar system among probably 100 billion other stars in this solar system. That's only one solar system, and now they know there are about 100 billion galaxies is the word I'm trying to use. Our solar system is maybe one out of 100 billion stars in our galaxy, the Milky Way galaxy, and they estimate that there may be as many as 100 billion galaxies, each one with 100 billion stars. So we're hardly the center of the universe.
We don't know.
We're hardly even unknown. We're just this little speck.
We only know about 5% of the life on this planet we figured out.
Yeah, well, I know. And as Darwin said, the Creator seemed to have an inordinate fondness for beetles. Because there are as many beetle species as all other animals species there are. Something like over 400,000 species of beetles. So he did seem to like, he or she seemed to like beetles a lot, for whatever reason.
Or the environment did.
But anyway, the point is that so that was the one. The
Armored
first big
and brainless.
shock was that we're not the center of the universe. We're not even the center of the solar system. That was a big shock to humans. The other big shock was Darwinian natural selection that shows that we're not the ultimate. We're just one of the many branches of all this evolutionary change. And as I said, I'm glad I'm a human. I'd much rather be a human than some other animal. As far as I know, I've never been another animal. But I think I would rather be a human. But the point is, we're just one of many organisms on Earth that has been, changing over time, flourishing, and we're now here.
But
We may not always be here. And part of the reason we may not be here is what we do to our environment. But whatever, that's another story, which we're not going to discuss right now. All right, I'll see you guys Wednesday. And Mitch and whoever else that came in late, I'd like to say.
All right, we're done.